Aang didn't defeat Fire Lord Ozai. He didn't conquer evil. He survived a moral dilemma that would have destroyed almost anyone else. We remember the ending of Avatar, The Last Airbender, as hopeful because the show never forces us to sit with what that final choice actually cost him. The music rises. Ozai is restrained. The comet fades. The war ends. Balance is restored and the world exhales. The story closes on peace, on smiles, on a future that finally feels open again. But survival is not the same thing as victory, and peace is not the same thing as resolution. The version of the ending most people carry with them is simple and comforting. Aang stayed true to himself. He refused to kill. He found a third way when everyone told him there wasn't one. Evil was stopped without sacrificing his soul, and the cycle of violence was broken. It feels clean. It feels earned. It feels like the perfect conclusion for a story built on compassion. But that version of the ending quietly avoids the most important question the finale never truly answers. What happens after? Because Aang's decision doesn't end when Ozai loses his bending. It doesn't end when the Fire Nation surrenders. It doesn't end when the Avatar state fades or when the screen cuts to black. That choice doesn't disappear into history. It follows Aang for the rest of his life, because unlike every Avatar before him, he doesn't externalize the cost of peace. He internalizes it. Aang wasn't standing at a heroic crossroads where one path was right and the other was wrong. He was trapped inside an impossible situation where every available option demanded that he betray something essential. The world demanded that Fire Lord Ozai be stopped permanently. Not delayed, not contained, not neutralized, removed as a threat forever. History had already shown what happens when tyrants are allowed to live. Entire generations pay the price. The Earth Kingdom burned for 100 years because one Fire Lord was allowed to keep breathing. Cities fell, cultures were erased. Children grew up in war because power was left unresolved. This is what the world understood, even if Aang didn't want to. At the same time, Aang's past lives demanded decisiveness, not cruelty, not rage, finality. They understood something Aang didn't yet want to accept. That being the Avatar means making choices that stain you so the world doesn't have to carry the stain itself. They weren't asking him to abandon morality. They were asking him to accept its consequences. Every past Avatar Aang speaks to carries the weight of this truth. They are not proud of the lives they took, but they are certain of why they did it. They understand that peace without enforcement is fragile and mercy without containment is dangerous. Their voices aren't cold. They're tired. And then there was Aang's air nomad upbringing, a culture built entirely around nonviolence, spiritual balance, and reverence for life. A philosophy that taught him killing wasn't just wrong, it was a spiritual failure. To take a life wasn't simply to end it. It was to sever yourself from harmony itself, from the cycle, from balance. To the air nomads, violence wasn't a tool, it was a corruption. These weren't three difficult choices, they were three mutually exclusive demands. Aang could save the world and violate his culture. He could honor his culture and risk the world. Or he could try to hold all three and be crushed under their weight. This is the part of the finale that often gets softened by nostalgia. We talk about Aang's refusal to kill his strength, and it is. But we rarely talk about the cruelty of the position he was placed in. The world did not give him a choice that allowed him to remain whole. Every Avatar before Aang resolved this contradiction with violence. Not because they were monsters, not because they lacked imagination, but because the world they lived in did not allow moral purity without consequence. They understood that sometimes peace isn't achieved through harmony but through containment. Sometimes balance requires force, not because it is good but because it is necessary. Aang was the first Avatar who refused to accept that premise, and the show frames that refusal as a triumph. But triumph does not mean escape. Energy bending is often treated as Aang's victory condition, as enlightenment, as proof that there was always another way, but energy bending does not eliminate the moral dilemma Aang faces. It does not dissolve it. It relocates it entirely onto him. Ozai does not die. The threat is not erased. The war does not end because evil is destroyed. It ends because Aang personally neutralizes it. That distinction matters because it means the responsibility does not vanish when the credits roll. It concentrates. Victory ends a conflict. Survival means you carry it with you. By choosing not to kill Ozai, Aang does not remove violence from the equation. He absorbs it. He becomes the container for it. Every avatar before him distributed that burden across history by making decisive, often brutal choices. Aang holds it alone. Ozai lives because Aang decided he should. Ozai breathes because Aang allowed it. Every consequence of that decision traces back to one moment of mercy. That is not moral superiority. That is moral endurance. And endurance leaves scars. The scars Aang carries are not physical. They are invisible, and that is exactly why they are so easy to ignore. The world looks at him and sees a savior, a hero, the boy who ended a 100-year war without becoming a monster. But Aang does not live inside the world's perception of him. He lives inside the aftermath of his choices. Survivor's guilt has always followed Aang like a shadow. It begins the moment he wakes up in the iceberg and learns that everyone he loved is gone. The air nomads were not just killed, they were erased. Their culture, their voices, their future, all wiped out while Aang was frozen in time. From that moment forward, Aang exists in a state of quiet self-blame. Not because he caused their deaths, but because he lived when they did not. That guilt never leaves him. It shapes his reluctance to fight, his fear of responsibility, his constant instinct to run when the weight becomes too heavy. And yet the finale places the heaviest burden of all directly on his shoulders. When Aang chooses not to kill Ozai, he does so with the full knowledge that the world expects him to. He knows what history demands. He knows what his past lives believe is necessary. And he knows that if he refuses, whatever happens next belongs to him alone. This is not the absence of responsibility, and it is the concentration of it. The show presents energy bending as a revelation, but psychologically it functions like a transfer of trauma. Instead of violence being resolved through finality, it is resolved through vigilance. Ozai's threat does not end. It is neutralized, monitored, and remembered. And Aang becomes the living anchor holding that memory in place. Every time peace holds, it is because Aang made a choice that cannot be undone. Every time the world remains stable, it is because he continues to exist. That is not closure. That is suspension. Moral injury is the term often used to describe what happens when someone is forced to violate their internal sense of right and wrong, not because they are evil, but because circumstances leave no clean option. Aang's injury is quieter than most. He does not kill, but he is still forced to decide who lives and who does not. He must accept that his mercy reshaped the world, and that any future suffering connected to Ozai traces back to him. That kind of responsibility does not fade. It deepens. The brilliance of the finale is that it allows Aang to remain spiritually intact while quietly ensuring he is never unburdened. He does not lose himself, but he loses the illusion that goodness is light. He learns that compassion can be heavy, that mercy can be exhausting, that choosing not to end violence does not mean violence disappears, and it means someone has to hold it. This reframes Aang's pacifism entirely. It is not passive, it is not easy, it is not naive. It is an active, lifelong commitment to restraint in a world that constantly tests it. Aang does not reject violence once. He rejects it every day that follows. And that is where the tragedy settles in. Because the story ends before we are forced to see what that commitment costs over decades. It ends before adulthood hardens choices into routines, before vigilance turns into fatigue, before the quiet knowledge of what could have been done differently starts to whisper. Aang's ending feels hopeful because it stops before the long-term consequences arrive. If the series had followed him longer, we would see that peace built on restraint is fragile. Not because it is weak, but because it depends on the continued presence of the person who made the choice. Aang becomes irreplaceable in a way no avatar should have to be. He is no longer just a bridge between worlds. He is a seal holding pressure back. The world praises him for what he did, but praise does not lessen the weight. If anything, it isolates him further. How do you express doubt when everyone sees your mercy as perfection? How do you admit exhaustion when the world believes you found the ideal solution? Aang survives the war, but he does not escape its gravity. This is why his ending is not a victory lap. It is a quiet continuation. The war ends, but the responsibility does not. Balance is restored, but only because someone is actively maintaining it, and that someone is a boy who never asked to inherit a broken world. The air nomads taught detachment, but they never taught isolation. Aang's choice places him in a position where no one else can truly share the burden he carries. Not Katara, not Zuko, not even future avatars, because the moment belongs to him alone. The show closes before this isolation becomes visible, but it is already there. It exists in the silence between celebration and reflection, in the space where questions linger but are never spoken. What if Ozai had died? What if mercy failed? What if history demanded more than kindness? Aang lives with those questions so the world does not have to. This is why the ending of Avatar endures, not because it is simple, but because it is restrained. It gives us just enough resolution to feel peace while leaving the deeper cost unspoken. It trusts the audience to sense that something heavier lies beneath the surface. Aang's survival is not about escaping violence. It is about choosing to stand between the world and it indefinitely. He becomes a living boundary, a reminder that peace is not a permanent state, but a maintained one. And maintenance is exhausting. The final irony is that Aang succeeds not by breaking the cycle of violence, but by absorbing it. He does not end the cycle, he interrupts it with himself. That is not a triumph you celebrate. It is a sacrifice you live with. The legacy of Aang's choice is not found in monuments or celebrations. It lives in the structure of the world that follows him. A world shaped not by decisive endings, but by restraint. A world where peace exists not because violence was erased, but because someone chose to stand in front of it and refuse to pass it along. This is what makes Aang's ending so unusual among heroic stories. Most heroes win by eliminating the threat. Aang wins by becoming the place where the threat stops. The conflict does not disappear, it reaches him and goes no further. That distinction matters because it changes how we understand what balance actually means. Balance in Avatar is often spoken about as harmony between opposing forces, light and dark, order and chaos. But Aang's ending suggests something more uncomfortable. That balance is not a state you achieve once. It is a condition you maintain, often at personal cost. The world does not become peaceful because Aang solved violence. It becomes peaceful because Aang accepted responsibility for containing it. That responsibility shapes everything that comes after. It shapes the kind of leader Aang becomes. It shapes how future avatars inherit the world. And it quietly reshapes what the avatar role itself represents. Before Aang, the avatar was a corrective force. When imbalance reached a breaking point, the avatar intervened decisively. After Aang, the avatar becomes something closer to a stabilizer, someone whose presence prevents collapse rather than delivers final judgment. That shift begins with one decision, and it is not a clean inheritance. Every avatar after Aang benefits from his restraint, but none of them carry the moment the way he does. They inherit a world that praises mercy without having to live through the doubt that created it. They grow up inside the outcome, not the uncertainty. Aang alone lives with the full memory of what could have happened. This is why his story feels complete and incomplete at the same time. The war ends, but the moral question does not. It simply becomes quieter, less visible, easier to ignore, but it never truly goes away. Aang's survival is not about avoiding darkness. It is about choosing to live alongside it without letting it define him. That is harder than victory, harder than sacrifice in a single moment. It is a lifelong discipline, and discipline is lonely. The show understands this, even if it never spells it out. That is why the finale does not linger on triumph. It does not show Aang celebrating his cleverness or congratulating himself for finding a loophole. Instead, it gives us stillness, reflection, a quiet sense of relief that does not quite resolve into joy. Because deep down, the story knows this was not a perfect ending. It was the least destructive one available. And that is the most adult conclusion Avatar could have reached. Aang's pacifism is not framed as a universal answer. It is framed as his answer, one that works because of who he is, not because it can be easily replicated. The show never suggests that violence is obsolete. It suggests that someone at some point must choose to absorb its consequences instead of passing them forward. Aang makes that choice, not once, but every day afterward. That is why it matters that Aang survives instead of wins. Winning implies finality. It implies closure. It implies that the story is over. Survival implies continuation. It implies responsibility. It implies that the hardest part comes after the applause fades. The ending of Avatar asks us to grow up with it, to recognize that goodness is not weightless, that compassion does not erase consequences, that sometimes the bravest thing is not ending a conflict, but choosing to live with what remains unresolved. Aang didn't defeat evil. He refuses to become it, and that refusal does not free him. It defines him. He carries a world that no longer burns but still remembers how close it came. He carries a choice that cannot be undone, only upheld. And he carries it quietly without asking for recognition, because recognition would not lighten the load. Aang's survival is not heroic in the loud way stories usually reward. It is heroic in the slow, sustained way that requires endurance instead of spectacle. The kind of heroism that does not end with a battle but begins after it. That is why his ending lasts. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Aang didn't win. He survived. And in a world built on violence, survival without surrender is its own kind of sacrifice.